The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.
Let me begin by asking you a question. When is the best time to crush fascism? To smash Nazism? This is not a rhetorical question. I want you to actually pause and answer that question. This is not a thought experiment or some useless intellectual navel gazing. I really want you to think about when is the best time to crush an ideology that at its core is about the complete genocide of an entire group of people, particularly Jews, generally anyone who is not pure, Aryan, anyone who may be LGBTQ, anyone who may, any number of categories that they hate with a special hatred in their heart for Jewish people. When is the best time to crush that ideology? And again, this is not a rhetorical question. I need you to actually think about this. Do we crush them in their nascent stages of organizing? Do we wait until, do we give them free speech long enough to organize into groups across the country, loosely affiliated groups across the country, where we've seen over the last year, just the last year, we've seen an increase from 99 to 121 official neo-Nazi organizations. And that's not including anti-Muslim hate groups or other hate groups. Do we wait? Is now the time to crush them? Or do we step back and we say they have the right to organize? They have the right to organize the destruction of entire groups of people because of free speech absolutism in the United States. Do we wait until they become political parties? I mean, they've become strong enough because we've given them the space in the name of free speech to organize as political parties and gain political power. Is that the time? Do we try to beat Nazism at the polls when so much is on the line? Or do we wait until they get in power and get rid of the same free speech that lifted them into power and decide that the best time to fight them is on the shores of Normandy? And then, of course, the natural response of some people is going to be, Ben, you're being hyperbolic. You're being dramatic. This isn't going to happen. Yes, it happened in the past, Ben, but we're more enlightened now. And I would just say to you, take a look at how close to power neo-Nazis are now. Take a look at the ideology that is running through the veins of conservatism today, particularly in our White House, and think of how close in proximity Nazis are to the White House today. And before you go into the pedanticism of overly precise definitions of playing their games, of saying, well, they're not actually Nazis in the National Socialist sense. They're just really just maybe white nationalists. Before you play that game, the semantic game, understand that there was the reason they called this rally this past weekend and last year, Unite the Right, because they understand the power of uniting all of those different variations of the same hate-filled ideology. So back to the question at hand. And let me ask it more specifically now. When is the best time to snatch the free speech away from people who would use that free speech to spread a cancerous ideology aimed at the complete annihilation of an entire group of people, and who would use free speech to get into power and then subsequently remove everyone else's freedom of speech? When is the appropriate time? In its nascent stages, when it's growing like it is in America now, or when they've grown so much that they actually are contenders at the poll, or when they get in power and they've taken your free speech away, or when they've grown so big that we have to have an all-out military assault against them. When was the best time to actively crush them? Now, let me ask it this way. Let me personalize it to you who disagree with me ever so vehemently. Let me ask you, when will you fight fascism? When will you feel that the time has become necessary? The time is now to fight against people who are organizing the destruction of everyone who is not them? When do you feel it is the best time to get involved? Because so much energy has been expended defending the free speech of Nazis that I have to ask the question for those of you on that side of the equation: when will you think that it is the appropriate time to fight Nazis? And when you answer that question, please leave it in the comment section or tweet me or something, because I don't mean this. I don't mean this rhetorically. I mean this as a literal question that I need you to answer so that I can get a better understanding of when the sense of urgency, the urgency of now, actually hits you and you realize that we don't have time to play with these Nazis anymore. At what point is it it's clearly not at the nascent stages. It's clearly not at the point where they're organizing and growing at a faster rate than they've grown in modern history. So is it at the point when they become political parties? Is that the point where you're now ready to fight Nazism? Both rhetorically and literally? Or if at that point you still are going to champion their right to organize in the United States of America, then what do you do when they get in power and they have expressed right now today in 2018, they have expressed their willingness to take away your free speech? Let me remind you.
But as far as government regulation, I mean, yes, I think in the short term we would favor government regulation of speech, but long term, are we even pro free speech?
No, of course not. But we have to use this platform in order.
So we're being radically honest here.
Yes, yeah. Radically pragmatic. Yes.
That second voice was Richard Spencer, one of the organizers of the Unite the Right last year, explaining why it is that he would use free speech to take away the free speech of other people. Is that the point when you decide to join me in the fight? I mean, I could even laugh at my participation in the fight. I'm just pointing out the intellectual inconsistencies and the problem with free speech absolutism. I mean, there are real people out there who are literally engaging in fights that are pushing Nazis back into the dregs of society. But for those of you who disagree with me using my platform, which we'll discuss more in a minute, but I need you to answer that question. At what point will you decide that it's time to fight Nazis? Because if it's up to me, I would prefer to crush them at the inception of their organizing, so that we don't have to crush them in an all-out military global assault. Ben, you're being an alarmist. You're being hyperbolic. Well, here's why I say this, and I say it in an alarming fashion, because I don't think people understand the seductiveness of hate. Not just hate speech, but hate. Hate is a seductive creature that offers simplistic solutions to very complex problems that have plagued us for generations. Hatred appeals to the lowest common denominator amongst us, and we are all subject to its allure, whether we want to admit it or not. We those of us who have not looked internally and been able to understand why it is that we have these feelings of ambivalence towards a person or a thing or even an idea, people who have not examined that are easily seduced by hatred. And Nazis understand this. This is why all they want, they understand all they need is the opportunity to share their message, and it will spread. When I covered the Nazis who came down to Georgia, it was early summer or late spring this year. They were fascinated with me. Well, at least a couple of them were, because they wanted for me to hear them out. They just wanted me to let them talk and hear them out. Meanwhile, I was plotting on how I could, shut down the entire event. So I really wasn't paying attention to what they had to say. But thinking in hindsight, they wanted nothing more than for me to hear them out. And as I started listening to them, they started to use Louis Farrakhan and his approach to Jewish people as a jumping off point, as a connection, as a way for me to identify with them, and to not just dismiss Nazism at face value for the hatred, for the hate-filled ideology that it is, but rather to take a minute to look at it from my perspective and to understand the Jewish problem from the perspective of a black person. This is what I mean, if you don't understand the seductive nature of that and how people can fall prey to that, then I don't really know if you're qualified to be in this conversation, because there's a reason we have to fight hatred. There's a reason we literally have to either with rhetorical arms or literal arms fight against the spread of hate-filled ideologies. Because people become easy prey for it. Whatever. Okay. I'm not going to spend much more time on that. I brought that up because hate spreads. Hate unchallenged spreads. And so the question still remains, when do you feel is the appropriate time to fight hate? More specifically, when is the appropriate time to realize that the free speech that you've granted them, they have now organized enough to take it away from you? Is that the point where you're ready now to fight against Nazism? I've gone over this many times on my show. We're dealing with the intersection of two different things. Philosophically, we're dealing with the idea of being intolerant towards intolerance and the apparent paradox that comes that, people have not resolved in their heads. And I've gone over Karl Popper's saying, his statement about this is that if we who are tolerant and want a tolerant society, if we tolerate intolerance, then we are allowing into our society intolerance. And that intolerance that we have allowed into our society will then do away with our tolerant society. Plainly put, if you tolerate Nazis, they will end your tolerant society. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is from a constitutional perspective here in the United States. Free speech absolutists, people at the ACLU, who I generally appreciate, but I think that they get this wrong because they don't see the qualitative difference between speech that is designed to destroy other people's free speech. And it's like we're missing the most obvious important fact of this. The most important aspect of this is that they're using their free speech to organize the destruction of an entire group of people. I think that should count for something. But if you reduce this down to being nothing more than a constitutional question, then what do you do when you're granting free speech to people who will destroy the free speech of others? Never mind the moral quandary of genocide, which should be ever present before us, but I digress. And then you have, I guess, those who want to operate in this conversation from a logical perspective. They feel like it is a slippery slope. But of course, all of those things pale in comparison to what is happening on the ground. And I feel like some people are really limiting this to an intellectual exercise or an exercise in whether or not they're willing to stand by the nobility of standing by the rights of people who hate. People who would, what's that uber liberal movie? Michael Douglas and the American president. How did he put it? He said people who would advocate at the top of their lungs that which we would have spent our entire lifetime advocating against. And he found nobility in standing by them and advocating for them, advocating for their right to use their free speech, to advocate against that which we would spend our entire lifetimes opposing. And then you have one other group who feel as though All we have to do is have a public competition of ideas, and we beat them in the public competition of ideas. And I think you are exactly the person for which I gave that entire, diatribe on the seductiveness of hate, the simplicity of hate. Our ideas are complex. They are superior because they are complex and they actually address the core issue, the core problem. But when you're dealing with people who aren't looking for complexity, they're looking for simplicity, and they run into the seductiveness of the simplicity of hatred, your idea is not going to win. Not all the time, not case by case. So if you feel that all we have to do is fight it out in the competition of ideas, then pray tell, how is it that it is spreading in the midst of all of your great ideas being there right now? Why is it that in a sea of YouTube commentary and blog posts and podcasts that give you competing ideas as alternate solutions to Nazism, to the problems that we face, rather, then why is it that Nazism is still spreading? Why is it that your ideas aren't winning? It's because of the simplicity and the seductiveness of hatred. Once that takes root in the person, you actually probably have to fight it out of them. And I'm wondering if I'm talking to people who've actually had to deal with this level of hatred. Like, not from a rhetorical perspective, but from a very personal perspective. I'm wondering if I'm dealing with people who've ever had to actually confront their own hatred, their own biases, their own scapegoating. Or do they feel that they are superior beings and never have succumbed to their moments of bigotry or their own moments of hatred? I think that may be the case. I think we may be dealing with people who feel some moral superiority to others because they've never confronted whatever bigotry or hatred they've dealt with. And they're approaching this from a moral superiority perspective, looking down on everyone else. Because if you actually have dealt with very personally, either with someone you love or with yourself, the power and the seductiveness of hatred and how quickly people can fall prey to it, then you don't really understand the urgency of why it is you have to fight hatred immediately. But my question still remains: at what point do you feel it's time to crush fascism? Now, why am I having this conversation yet again? Well, last night I tweeted out the following picture of the Third Reich in its full glory, I guess you would say, where it looks as though there are literally 100,000 Nazis lined up. You can go to my timeline and see it. And I captioned it this way. I said, quote, "When free speech absolutists have their way." And I woke up to Glenn Greenwald, who I do consider friendly. We may be a little upset with each other this morning, but he tweeted this back to me. He said, "This is offensive and historically ignorant. Nazis didn't rise to power from free speech absolutism, but censorship, book burnings, art destruction, banning of Einstein science. Jews have long been amongst the leaders of free speech movement for a reason." Now, never mind him taking the tweet out of context, because clearly, if you're looking at that, I'm not saying that Nazis rose to power by being free speech absolutists. I'm saying Nazis rose to power on the wings of people who would not crush their speech when they became a threat in the nascent stages, when they became a threat in their early organizing stages. People who would not, and furthermore, before I even finish that, because I don't like explaining myself to anybody, particularly people who have actively engaged in their own versions of whatever Twitter literary device that was. It's not sarcasm. I don't really consider it dark humor. I do consider it hyperbole to make an extreme point. The point is this, is when Nazism goes unchallenged, it grows. Better yet, when Nazism isn't crushed, when you see it, it grows. This is historically accurate. This is what happens. And even in further, even more context of everything that I've been talking about, tweeting about, everything that anyone who has ever complained about the lack of context. In America, when we have given unchallenged platforms to Nazis, we see what we saw in 2017 in Charlottesville. A thriving, energetic, and growing hate-filled ideology of the right. That's what you see when it goes unchallenged. What do you see when you see it challenged at every turn, both rhetorically and physically? You see what you saw in 2018 in Washington, D.C. A demoralized, an unorganized, and a fractionalized group of Nazis. That's what you see when you actively combat them. You do not get a fractionalized and demoralized Nazi by simply saying, oh, let's have a competition of ideas. That's what they want because they understand the simplicity of their hate. They understand the seductiveness of their hate. They understand that no matter how right you may be or your solutions may be, there is an appeal that hatred has. There is an alluring appeal of hatred that will always inculcate someone. It will always spread. And all they need is the opportunity to be heard. And that's what they want more than anything else. And that is what free speech absolutists in the United States give them every single day. Not only in terms of the federal government. Fine. We're not challenging their constitutional right. I'm not doing that yet. I would argue maybe we need to, but not in this conversation. In this conversation, I'm not advocating for them to implement laws like Germany currently has towards Nazism. So be it. But in terms of the rhetorical public debate, in terms of competing First Amendment rights, in terms of people with large platforms like Glenn Greenwald, like Kyle Kalinske, like other people who constantly lament whenever there's a confrontation between Nazis and between fascists and anti-fascists, who constantly appeal to the free speech rights of Nazis in the public discourse, we're not even talking about government suppression of speech. We're talking about free speech absolutists who would look at us who simply say, fine, you want them to have free speech, then we're going to fight them like hell with our free speech. And yet we have people on our side of the equation, ostensibly, who are looking at us and saying, you're being ridiculous. I mean, you spent more time, Glenn, arguing with me about the nature of my joke, my tongue-in-cheek hyperbole, my dark, whatever Twitter literary device it falls in. I was making a point, and you spent more time upset about the point than the fact that Nazis actually are running rampant in this country. Let me finish reading. And then he said, if you want to claim that you were being sarcastic or joking, fine, go ahead. I didn't read it that way, nor did many people who saw your tweet. Well, actually, a lot of people understood exactly what I was talking about because they liked and retweeted. There's nothing fun, amusing about accusing people. This is the core sentence right here from Glenn Greenwald this morning. And again, I've done business with Glenn. I've done videos for The Intercept. They paid me. I was on the payroll for 3 months. So I don't have any hatred towards Glenn. I'm not upset with Glenn. This is just really a disagreement that matters. That's the only way I can describe it. It's a disagreement that really matters. And this is what he said. He said, quote, there's nothing fun and amusing about accusing people of breeding and fueling Nazism, which is what your tweet did. So this is you understood. You did understand my tweet. But your first response was to try to silence me through accusing me of being ahistorical, which I would argue I was not ahistorical. I might have been hyperbolic, but not ahistorical. But then you understood the entire time. So that first tweet we could just throw out the window because you understood exactly what I'm saying. Here it is. He says, there's nothing fun and amusing about accusing people of breeding and fueling Nazism, which is what your tweet did. That is exactly what free speech absolutists are doing. You may not want to admit it. You may not want to own up to it. But when you understand, when you're face to face with Nazis and all they want to do is have a chance to preach their gospel of hate to you, that's all they want, because they know it's a numbers game. The more people they talk to, the more people they're going to convert. If you understand that, then you have to understand the responsibility of people who are out here fighting for that free speech have with the rise of Nazism, particularly in the United States of America. You can't absolve yourself of that. You can't wash your hands of that. I'd argue people who are just silently standing by while it happens are responsible as well. You have to own up to this, because this is what you stand for. Not just Glenn, I'm just talking to people in general at this point. People in general who feel that it is more pertinent that we defend the free speech of Nazis than it is to crush them in their nascent stages. Then you are fueling the rise of Nazism, because what they want more than anything else is just the opportunity to be heard. Why? Because, and like I've said 20 times, but I'll say it again, they understand the seductive nature of what they are preaching. They understand the allure of hate and the overly simplistic solutions that it offers, that if we just get rid of all the immigrants, then black unemployment will go away. Take a minute and digest what I just did there. It is the overly simplistic solutions of scapegoating and hatred that has an allure that grows an audience faster than you can ever imagine, that will elevate someone like Donald Trump to the White House. And I find that it is critical at this juncture for us to point out the culpability of free speech absolutists in that process. And if that offends you, if that makes you upset, then maybe you should take a minute to understand why I make that case, why I make that claim. You can reject it all you want, but people of good conscience understand exactly what I'm saying, is that if it's more important for you to defend the speech of Nazis than it is to crush the speech of Nazis, then you are culpable in the rise of Nazism in this country. Whether you are a good person at your core or not, I am not questioning that. Whether you have good intentions or not, I am not questioning that. Whether you are a moral person that is seeking to make a better society, I am not questioning that. What I am questioning is whether or not you understand that all Nazism needs to spread historically and currently is the opportunity to be heard unchallenged. And you are providing that opportunity by pushing back against us who are simply saying, fine, you want a platform? We're going to give you hell with our platform. Fine. You want free speech? Then you are going to catch literal hell with our free speech, fighting you tooth and nail at every turn. Every time you crawl out of your hate-filled, barbaristic, genocidal caves, we'll be there to push you back. We're going to be there to ensure that the people see opposition to it, and to make sure that Nazis will always fear showing their faces in public. Because when they want nothing more than to spread genocide, crushing them is the moral thing to do.
As the great parliamentarian Edmund Burke said, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And that, in essence, is why I am here today.
The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.